This is When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, where I talk about the films that shaped the MTV generation. A few episodes back, I discussed Arena, An Absurd Notion, Duran Duran's weird sci-fi themed concert film, which was directed by pioneering music video director and MTV darling Russell Mulcahy. Today's pick, 1986's Highlander, was also directed by Mulcahy, from a screenplay by Gregory Wyden, Peter Bellwood, and Larry Ferguson, from a story idea by Wyden, who wrote the Highlander script while he was still an undergraduate at UCLA's film school. Filmed in New York, London, and Scotland, Highlander didn't make much of a splash upon release. It only made $12 million back on a $19 million budget. But it has since launched an extensive franchise and has become deeply embedded in the pop culture consciousness. Highlander is now regarded as a beloved cult favorite, and you know why? It's because it's totally awesome. At Madison Square Garden, a man named Connor MacLeod grimly watches a wrestling match. MacLeod is played by French-American actor Christopher Lambert, then best known for Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes, and for Luc Besson's Subway. MacLeod leaves in the middle of the match and heads to the parking garage, where a man in a suit and aviator sunglasses steps out of the darkness. They exchange a few words, whereupon we learn that the man is named Fazil, and then they both whip out swords and start trying their best to behead each other. Fazil is played by legendary stuntman Peter Diamond, who worked on the original Star Wars trilogy. The sword master on Highlander was the legendary Olympic fencer and fight choreographer Bob Anderson, who also worked on the original Star Wars trilogy, as well as on The Princess Bride, The Mask of Zorro, and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There's a whole lot of sword fighting in Highlander, and your mileage may vary based on your feelings about long fight scenes, but they're well shot, well choreographed, and performed with zeal, and I find them pretty darn entertaining. Ultimately, MacLeod manages to behead Fazil, whereupon Fazil's decapitated corpse glows blue. MacLeod absorbs a burst of energy strong enough to start the motors of all the cars in the garage. MacLeod is stopped by the NYPD as he's leaving the parking garage. And then we find ourselves in Scotland in 1536, where MacLeod, looking no younger but considerably hairier than his mid-80s New York self, is heading out with members of his clan to battle a rival clan. He bids farewell to his lover Kate, played by prolific English actress and novelist Celia Imrie. Imrie is very famous in the UK, but less well known here in the US. Among her many roles, she played a rebel fighter pilot in Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. Waiting for MacLeod on the battlefield is a malevolent black-clad warrior known as the Kurgan. There are many great things about Highlander, but the Kurgan is pretty obviously the greatest. He's one of the most entertaining film villains of all time, both for his aura of unstoppable malice and for his gleefully obnoxious sense of humor. He's played by Clancy Brown, whom we saw a few weeks back in The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension, and who is also known for doing a little bit of everything. You've probably seen him in dozens of film and TV shows, ranging from The Shawshank Redemption to Starship Troopers to Lost. On the battlefield, the Kurgan promptly impales MacLeod on his broadsword, though he's driven back by members of MacLeod's clan before he can decapitate him. Back in New York, at the crime scene, a forensic scientist and weapons expert named Brenda Wyatt, played by Chicago Hope's Roxanne Hart, finds Fazil's ancient sword, which she shows to Police Lieutenant Moran, played by Alan North. Aiding in the investigation is Detective Bedso, who is played by the late character actor John Polito of Miller's Crossing. At the precinct, MacLeod is questioned by Moran as to what he was doing in the parking garage. MacLeod identifies himself as an antiques dealer named Russell Nash. Meanwhile, the Kurgan drives into Manhattan, dressed all in black leather and sporting a deep scar across his neck. He checks into a Fleabag hotel and assembles his collapsible broadsword. Yes, there are probably good reasons why a broadsword should not feature a collapsible blade, but it looks cool. Because the Kurgan is sleazy as well as evil, he's visited by a sex worker named Candy, who is played by pinup model Corinne Russell, who also starred in the video for AC/DC's You Shook Me All Night Long. Highlander is my sister's all-time favorite movie, and has been ever since shortly after its 1986 release, when she first saw it at a friend's house on VHS. In her final week of her junior year of high school, in the blow-off time after finals, she and her classmates convinced their AP history teacher to let them watch Highlander in class, because it's historical. Anyway, they reached this scene with Candy before their teacher got wise that this was probably not a film they should be watching in school, and shut off the VCR. MacLeod returns to the parking garage and retrieves his cool samurai sword, which he'd hidden in the ceiling beams while fleeing the crime scene. He spots Brenda investigating and trails her to a local bar where he makes extremely creepy small talk with her. Suspicious, Brenda follows him after he leaves, whereupon both Brenda and MacLeod get ambushed by the Kurgan. MacLeod and the Kurgan begin fighting, but an NYPD helicopter hovers overhead and everybody scatters. And then we're back in 1536, where a gravely wounded MacLeod has been rescued from the battlefield, though he's not expected to survive. The next day, though, he's up and about and fully healed. Kate believes this must be the devil's work, and his clan members are inclined to agree, so MacLeod finds himself violently exiled from his home. MacLeod establishes a blissful life in the Highlands with Heather, a beautiful Scottish lass played by Poldark's Beatty Edney. They're disrupted by the arrival of a flashily dressed man on a white horse who is played by the legendary Sean Connery. Highlander caught Connery during a rare lull in his career. This was post-James Bond, but before his major career renaissance of the late 80s and 90s kicked off with big roles in The Untouchables, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and The Hunt for Red October. He introduces himself to MacLeod as Juan Sanchez Villalobos Ramirez, an Egyptian by way of Spain. Just from being around him, MacLeod feels a surge of strange power. Ramirez explains that it's a sensation an immortal feels upon meeting another immortal. When one immortal kills another immortal through decapitation, there's a great surge of that power, which is known as the quickening. Ramirez becomes MacLeod's mentor and trains him to battle his fellow immortals, who are destined to kill each other until only a few remain, whereupon they'll be summoned to the gathering. They'll all go to a distant location where they'll fight until only one remains. The victor will receive the prize, which is unlimited knowledge. So we have the quickening, the gathering, the prize, and of course Highlander's iconic catchphrase, "There can be only one." The story of Highlander revolves around a very simple, very sturdy, buzzword-laden mythology, and it's all very catchy. This is a film that is engineered to become a cult classic. Ramirez tells MacLeod about the Kurgan, a ruthless immortal from the steppes of Russia. Ramirez also counsels MacLeod to avoid future heartbreak by dumping Heather, who is destined to grow old and die while MacLeod remains young and healthy, at least until such time as someone cuts his head off. I know I just said Highlander's mythology was simple, but you do have to wrap your head around one rather paradoxical concept, which is that you're immortal until you die. Ramirez tells MacLeod a story about his fancy sword, which is a katana with an intricate ivory hilt, the same one we have seen MacLeod carrying around in 20th century New York. The sword was given to Ramirez by his wife, a Japanese princess who died centuries ago. One night while Heather and Ramirez are dining together, the Kurgan arrives. He and Ramirez battle, and the Kurgan ultimately decapitates Ramirez. Back in New York, Brenda shows up at MacLeod's antique shop. She'd found traces of metal from his one-of-a-kind samurai sword at the parking garage, and she's desperate to learn more about it. MacLeod's loyal assistant Rachel, played by Sheila Gish, attempts to give Brenda the runaround, but MacLeod invites himself over to Brenda's house for dinner. In the European release of Highlander, which is a bit longer than the US version, we get more of Rachel's backstory, in which we learned that MacLeod rescued her from Nazis when she was a young girl during World War II. None of that is necessary, but Rachel gets a few key moments in the film, and it's nice having more information about how exactly she fits into MacLeod's life. Sheila Gish, who died in 2005, was an acclaimed English stage actress who was married to Dennis Lawson, Ewan McGregor's uncle, who played rebel fighter pilot Wedge Antilles in the original Star Wars trilogy. MacLeod arrives at Brenda's apartment for their dinner date and presents her with a gift-wrapped copy of a book on sword making that she wrote, which A, is a lousy hostess gift, and B, is his dickish way of letting her know that he knows she's with the NYPD and thus is probably investigating him. She tries to persuade him that her interest in him has nothing to do with Fazil's murder, but their date ends early on a hostile note. Back in the Highlands, Heather has grown old and gray even as MacLeod has remained young. After extracting a promise from him that he'll light a candle every year on her birthday, Heather dies, leaving MacLeod heartbroken. In New York, MacLeod meets with another immortal on the Central Park Bow Bridge. This is Castigear, played by British actor Hugh Corshey, best known to US audiences for playing Captain Panaka in Star Wars The Phantom Menace. MacLeod and Castigear are old friends, and even though they've both been summoned to New York for the gathering, and thus only one of them will be leaving the Big Apple with his head still attached, they have a good time reminiscing about the past. That night, a self-styled vigilante named Kirk Matunis patrols the city streets and comes across the Kurgan battling Castigear in an alley. Matunis is played by Christopher Malcolm, who was one of the rebel fighter pilots on Hoth in The Empire Strikes Back. There are a surprising number of connections between Highlander and the greater Star Wars universe. The Kurgan beheads Castigear, whereupon Matunis opens fire on the Kurgan, who impales him on his broadsword. An injured Matunis survives and witnesses the Kurgan absorbing Castigear's energy. In the hospital, Lieutenant Moran and Detective Bedso interview Matunis, who insists that the man who beheaded Castigear was not Connor MacLeod, aka Russell Nash. Brenda does some digging through records and discovers that Russell Nash died as a baby. For the past 2 centuries, Connor MacLeod has been taking on the identities of dead people and passing down ownership of his fabulous New York apartment to himself. McCloud lights a candle on Heather's birthday at a cathedral. He's joined by the Kurgan, who has shaved his head because his description is circulating in the local newspapers thanks to Matunis. The arbitrary yet binding rules of immortal behavior dictate that immortals can't fight each other on holy ground, so McCloud and the Kurgan have a venom-laden conversation during which the Kurgan ogles some nuns and casually mentioned that he'd raped Heather right after killing Ramirez, which is something McCloud hadn't known. When Brenda shows up at the antiques dealership demanding answers as to why McCloud appears to have been alive for at least 200 years, McCloud spills the beans to her about his immortality, which he demonstrates by having Brenda stab him in the gut. Somehow this makes Brenda hot, and they sleep together. I will say, I think Brenda and McCloud are both good characters, and I think Christopher Lambert and Roxanne Hart have great chemistry together, but their romance is really awkward from start to finish, considering that Brenda is pretty sure he decapitated some dude in a parking garage. My reaction to them falling into bed together after he makes her stab him is mostly along the lines of, huh, that's weird. When Brenda returns home, she finds the Kurgan waiting for her. He takes her on a wild joyride, then leaves her dangling from the giant neon Silvercup Studios sign in Long Island City. I used to live in Queens, and you can see that Silvercup sign from the N train on the approach to Queensboro Plaza, and it's impossible to look at it without thinking of Highlander. McCloud arrives, and the Kurgan and McCloud battle to the death in a big dramatic climax. McCloud eventually gets the upper hand and decapitates the Kurgan, who explodes into a giant burst of blue light. Windows shatter, lightning flashes, and some sketchy CGI demons swirl around a levitating McCloud, who has won the prize. We end with McCloud and Brenda snuggling together in the Highlands, where Brenda has bizarrely undergone a makeover to make her look more like Heather. McCloud tells her about the prize. He can hear the thoughts of everyone in the world, which sounds like a mixed blessing, and he's able to grow old and die, which is definitely a mixed blessing. It's impossible to talk about Highlander without mentioning its very famous and very good soundtrack. Russell Mulcahy approached Queen about possibly writing and recording a song for it, and Queen liked the early footage so much that they wrote and recorded an entire album for it. Queen's 1986 album, A Kind of Magic, serves as the unofficial Highlander soundtrack. It includes a whole bunch of songs that are used throughout the film, including A Kind of Magic, 1 Year of Love, Who Wants to Live Forever, Gimme the Prize, and Princes of the Universe. Queen's music works splendidly with Highlander. It's a big dramatic film, and these are big dramatic songs. The film looks great. You can tell that Mulcahy honed his skills in the realm of MTV because his visuals are strong and attention-grabbing. One of the signature stylistic elements of Highlander is the way it uses creative and elaborate transitions between the flashbacks in Scotland and the present in New York. The entire film features a great deal of interesting and stylized camera work. Really, Highlander is just fun to watch. It's filled with moments that are designed to grab attention. It's populated with larger-than-life characters like the Kurgan and Ramirez. It has a highly quotable script that's often very funny. It's a film without themes or layers of meaning. It's just there to entertain, and it does that very, very well. I mentioned before that Highlander centers around a simple yet irresistible mythology, which makes it similar in some regards to the original Star Wars trilogy, which of course were films that were very important to many of us in Gen X. The mythologies of both can be summed up with popular catchphrases. May the Force be with you. There can be only one. They're films that tap into the Gen X need to be individual and distinct from each other. Being an immortal is pretty much akin to being a Jedi. Like Star Wars, Highlander expanded into a sprawling franchise that both built upon and weakened its basic mythology. 1991's Highlander 2: The Quickening, which was also directed by Mulcahy and which somehow brought poor decapitated Ramirez back to life, introduced the idea that the immortals, Ramirez and McCloud included, were actually aliens from the planet Zeist. Like the midichlorians in The Phantom Menace, this was an alteration of the core mythology that no one asked for. There have been 3 other Highlander sequels: 1994's Highlander: The Final Dimension, also known as Highlander 3: The Sorcerer, 2000's Highlander Endgame, and 2007's Highlander: The Source. Those last 2 are extensions of the Highlander television series, which aired from 1992 to 1998. There's also been a spin-off of the spin-off, an animated series, and a number of tie-in novels, comic books, and video games. For a film that fizzled upon its release in theaters, Highlander eventually found its audience and became a pop culture juggernaut. And speaking of pop culture juggernauts, next time I'm going to look at Tim Burton's 1989 Batman, one of the decade's rare successful attempts to launch a comic book film franchise. Thank you very much for joining me, and I will see you then.